it's Dr. Eichelberger here, and I'm here to talk to you today about how you can be free from disease one bite at a time. So when we're talking about how to be free from disease, it's a good idea to know what kind of diseases there are, and you can simplify it down by describing them as two kinds of disease. So the two kinds are acute diseases, diseases that are happening in the short term, and chronic diseases that are happening over time and that tend to be more degenerative. So the acute diseases, like I say, are diseases that happen more or less suddenly. They come on pretty quickly. They don't tend to last very long, and you usually recover from them pretty quickly. Modern medicine is pretty good with those. You get an infection, they can smack it down. Usually, you break your arm, you get a cut, they can patch you back together. So acute disease is really well handled by modern Western medicine. Now, the other kind is chronic diseases. Chronic diseases happen slowly over time. They come on very gradually, and they are a result of a lot of little stresses on the body, and those little stresses can come from a whole bunch of different places, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the point I wanted to make here is that recovery can happen, but it takes time because they're slow coming on. They're also slower going away. And they don't respond very well to the typical Western medicine silver bullet approach, which is find a really high-powered drug and fire it off to the one thing that's supposedly causing this. The body's just too complex for that, and it's not going to respond to one high-powered bullet. It needs a more comprehensive approach. In other words, you have to address lifestyle and health history factors in order to really address these kind of chronic illnesses effectively. All right. So, to do that, it's helpful to understand how complex it really is inside the body when we're trying to bring back a healthy state of balance, a state of vital, energetic, clear, focused energy. And so I've come to call that black box medicine, and the reason is this. I personally believe that your body is designed to work perfectly, but because there are so many physiological processes, in the body alone, there are 50,000 biochemical processes going on all the time. And I actually have a picture of that I found, and it's this picture here called metabolic pathways, and this is just talking about the interactions between all the various biochemical processes at a cellular level and in the organs and the tissues and so forth that just keep us going. That's pretty complicated looking, Who wants to deal with that? That's a lot to deal with. And you can imagine how just picking one little tiny piece out of that drawing and changing it might not be an effective approach to deal with the whole thing if there's more than one thing out of balance. And that's the problem with Western medicine the way it is right now. So, let's see, make that a little bigger. Yeah, you can see how that is. It's like just terribly complex. All right. So back to the drawing here. So and not only is there this many things going on biochemically, but there's also structural things. There's things happening at different levels. There's the organs, there's the tissues, there's systems like the autonomic nervous system, the respiratory system, the digestive system, and so forth, and all the way down to the cells and parts of the cells within the cells. So there's just layers to these processes, and they all interact. So actually it's an amazing thing to be aware of, but it's also an amazing thing to try and interact with because there are so many moving parts. How do you deal with that? Of course, in Western science, we try and reduce things down to their basic components, and that's why it's called reductionist science. The problem with that is there is no silver bullet. There's just too many moving parts for one silver bullet thing to make a huge difference. And certainly not without having a lot of different side effects. So that kind of explains why people who have chronic illnesses don't respond well or don't really get the problem fixed by taking some of these prescription drugs. And it's not that the prescription drugs aren't powerful, it's not that they aren't effective at what they do, but there's a lot of unintended consequences from taking them based on how complex everything is. So, the idea of black box medicine is that when things go wrong, it's actually easier to look at the inputs and the outputs. And so I'd like to show you a picture of that, if I can pull it up here in a second. There it is. All right. So there's the picture of black box medicine, and hopefully you can see that clearly enough. And so the black box in the middle is just all that complexity that we were talking about just a moment ago. All that stuff going on that's all connected and all interrelated that is very hard to deal with in any kind of isolated way. So the easy way to deal with that is to think about what are the things that affect that, and how do we know whether those things are affecting it in a positive way or a negative way. And so I've chosen to call that inputs, those are on the left, and the outputs, which are on the right. So the inputs are things like genetics, where your ancestors grew up. Your thoughts and your emotions have a definite effect on your physiology and on your health. The quality of your relationships has an effect on it. The amount of exercise that you get and the quality of that exercise. The food that you eat, the water and other liquids that you drink, your stress levels, and of course environmental exposures, things like electromagnetic and toxic substances that you might come in contact with. All of those things have an effect on the body. And considering how complex the body is, that's really not a lot of categories of things to have an effect. So it's actually a lot more manageable than dealing with 50,000 biochemical reactions. How do you know how those things are affecting you? Well, if your body is designed to work perfectly, you look at the outputs. What's your energy level like? How motivated are you? What's your productivity like? How effective are you in the world? Are you enjoying your life? Or are you cranky or depressed or unhappy? That goes back to mood as well. Are you comfortable? Do you have pain? Do you have stiffness? Do you have aches? Or do you just do what you need to do and you feel comfortable in your body and free? Can you get around easily? Are you positive about your life? Is your outlook good? And of course, really important is, how well are you sleeping? That's an important one. All right. So that's kind of the summary of black box medicine. We've talked about the inputs and the outputs there. So among all those inputs and outputs, it's kind of interesting to see which ones we have control of. Let's pull that up again for a second. We don't really have control over our genetics. We do have a fair amount of control over our thoughts and emotions, although I'm not going to be really dealing with that here in this video. They're really important. If you have thoughts that make you feel rotten, well, that's going to affect your whole quality of life. Your relationships, you have a certain amount of influence and control over that, the quality of those. You can certainly control your exercise, the food that you eat, what you choose to drink, and stress, maybe. You may not have control over the stress going on in the world around you, but you may have control over how you respond to it. Environment, well, you can have control over trying to avoid those things, but if you've already been exposed to them, then you have some control over finding out what may be infecting you that way in terms of, let's say, toxic heavy metals, and get rid of those out of your body.